When dinner guests arrived at the Goldmark residence on Christmas Eve, they never imagined the horrific scene that lay inside. Investigators would discover 4 family members who had been brutally tortured. The crime scene would reveal a bizarre conspiracy executed by a disturbed and merciless young man. Who were these victims, and who was the monster who had murdered them during the holiday season? In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. 'Twas the night before Christmas 1985, and the beautiful, affluent Seattle neighborhood was lined with decorated homes, festive and brightly lit for the holiday season. It was early evening as dinner guests approached the lovely Goldmark family residence, their front door adorned with a wreath. The tradition of sharing a Swedish dinner and exchanging gifts was something everyone involved looked forward to each season. They noticed the house was completely dark, except for one light. The guests rang the doorbell, but no one answered. This was strange, but they thought there must be some explanation for why their hosts weren't responding. Around 15 to 20 minutes passed, and still none of the Goldmark family appeared, so the guests decided to leave the residence and go home. They attempted to contact the family members by phone, but the line was busy. Something was off, and the guests became concerned that the Goldmarks may need help. When they returned to their residence, they thought they heard a deep moaning sound coming from inside the home. They left and drove over to one of their neighbors, a man named Jeffrey Haley, who had a spare key to the Goldmark home. Jeffrey, along with his brother Peter, rushed over to the Goldmarks. Jeffrey Haley turned the key and entered the residence. The man heard a startling sound. It was a very loud and deeply disturbing moan. There was no one in sight. As they climbed the stairs, they could see a body lying in front of the master bedroom. Inside the room lay 3 more bodies. Charles and Annie Goldmark had both been handcuffed with their arms behind their backs. Annie Goldmark appeared to have been stabbed in the chest. Charles Goldmark seemed to have a serious head injury. The men were shocked to see that he was still alive. Charles was thrashing around on the carpet, screaming and belligerent. He didn't seem to even realize that the Haley brothers were there. They located a hacksaw to cut off his handcuffs, hoping that this would calm his panicked state. The men immediately called 911 and waited outside for the first responders to arrive. When the police and firefighters came, they discovered a very grisly and horrific scene. Mrs. Annie Goldmark appeared to have been stabbed in the chest. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The 2 young sons, 10-year-old Colin and 12-year-old Derek, had been strangled. Sweaters had been used as ligatures on the children. They were knotted so tightly around their small necks that firefighters could not insert their fingers under the sweaters to release them. Finally, they did free the 2 boys from the suffocating knots. Amazingly, both were still breathing. The father and his 2 children were treated at the scene and then rushed to the nearest hospital. The youngest child, 10-year-old Colin, died 4 days after he arrived. Charles, who never regained consciousness, passed away after 16 days in the hospital. Derek, 12 years old, fought the longest and hardest to survive, but tragically, he would also succumb to his injuries 37 days after the attack. Charles Goldmark, 43, Annie Goldmark, 41, and their sons, Derek, 12, and Colin, 10, had all been victims of a horrendous family murder. The entire Goldmark family had been slain. In the master bedroom, detectives found a knife and a steam iron, the weapons presumed to be used in the assault on the family. Blood, spatter, painted every wall. The blood-stained patterns indicated that the victims had been struck with the iron while they lay helpless on the floor. The day after Christmas, a man named Hussein Omar Sufadia, also known as Robert Brown, contacted the police regarding a bizarre letter he found amongst the belongings of a guest staying with him at his apartment. Apparently, he came across one of his notebooks, and inside it was a letter that said, "To whom it may concern, I am the person you were looking for in the Goldmark case." When officers met with Robert Brown near his apartment, he told the police that the suspect's name was David Rice. While en route to meet the witness, investigators noticed a man who matched the description given by Mr. Brown. They watched as he walked down the steps of the apartment and down the street. The police walked after him, but when they approached the man, he turned and ran off. Officers chased him a few blocks until in mid-chase the suspect stopped. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a vial, took a sip of a liquid, and tossed the vial away. The police found the vial, and when tested it was shown to contain liquid nicotine. The man was identified as 27-year-old David Lewis Rice and was taken promptly into police custody. Mr. Robert Brown later brought down the suspect's notebook and handed it over to detectives. When the homicide investigator presented the letter to David Rice during his interrogation, he openly admitted to writing it. The full letter stated the following: "To whom it may concern, I am the person you were looking for in the Goldmark case. I know that what I did was a very terrible thing. That is why I am as you see me now. I want it perfectly understood that no one else had anything whatsoever to do with what I did. I went to great lengths to make sure of that. The person that I live with doesn't even know that I am wanted on a different charge." She received a couple of messages on her machine, but I erased them before she got to them. "I did not use the rifle that I purchased a few weeks ago. Instead, I fooled them with a toy pistol, which you will find in the storage locker. I threw the rifle," pistol was originally written then crossed out in the letter, "away a couple of weeks ago. Again, I want it understood that no one knew anything about this, so please do not cause any unnecessary suffering to innocent people. I think that I've already done enough. I guess I should tell you why I did what I did. That way you won't have to ask other people about it. My life is a mess. It has been since my wife left. Anne has been trying to help me straighten it out, but I'm afraid." And that is where the letter stopped. When asked if he would like to finish what he had begun writing, David Rice agreed and wrote, "I am afraid that she isn't able to do much for me. I am much too far gone. When I left high school, I could go out and get a job in any town at any time I needed one. When I got married, jobs were starting to get scarce. I had to do more walking and searching to find work. I found myself more and more on the unemployment line, which was getting longer and longer. I went to the government offices to see what I could do to alleviate my employment situation, and they recommended that I go to school and learn engineering." Then David Lewis Rice stopped and informed the detective that he was willing to tell them his story, but he wanted to speak first with an attorney. His lawyer, William Lanning, arrived shortly after and spoke with his client for about an hour and a half. Mr. Lanning then provided the police with a signed statement by his client. He informed them that his client, Mr. Rice, wished to speak with the investigators about the incident, and he fully understood that anything he said could be used against him in court. David Rice sat down with two detectives in a tape-recorded interview to listen to his strange and disturbing confession of being the person who attacked the Goldmark family on Christmas Eve. David Rice laid out to investigators what had motivated him to commit the killings, his specific acts of premeditation, and how he had executed the crime. He claimed that his primary motivation was one of financial gain. As aforementioned in the letter, he had been struggling to find work and was having trouble making ends meet. David Rice had lost his job more than a year before the murders occurred. He had fallen into deep debt and was staying at his former girlfriend Ann Davis's apartment off and on since August of that year. When she left for Christmas, he was permitted to reside at her place and even generously left him some food and a little money. However, it was agreed upon that once he returned from vacation, he had to be off the premises. David Rice began to panic. He had run out of his unemployment compensation 4 to 5 months earlier and was becoming desperate. While his friend Ann was gone, he even stole her television, pawning it for $10. If he robbed the very wealthy Goldmark family, it would fix his terminal, ever-growing financial problems. But, according to the suspect, financial gain was only one of his motivations. David Lewis Rice was convinced that the patriarch of the Goldmark family, Charles, was a head member of the local Communist Party. David Rice believed that, if placed under duress, Charles Goldmark would confess to his involvement and provide details to him about the other local communists. He was on a mission to work all the way up to the leaders of the Communist Party in the United States, whom he believed were conspiring to take over the nation. David Rice would later state that his heinous actions were driven by half economic desperation and half by his motivation to get information to take down the Communist Party. He had been laying the groundwork for his crime about 6 months before the Christmas Eve attack. On the day of the murders, David Rice had intended to kill Charles and Ann Goldmark. However, he claimed that the deaths of the 2 innocent children were not part of the plan. David Rice stated that he didn't expect the kids to be there, and he wouldn't have gone over to their home if he had known they were there. But, as he said, once he realized the 2 boys were there, he didn't feel he had much of a choice but to kill everyone. I find this claim to be insincere and very unbelievable, if not delusional. It was Christmas Eve. They were a close-knit family. Where else were the children expected to be if not with their parents on the night before Christmas? It seems as if this statement was only expressed to support the notion that he didn't plan on killing 2 little kids, no less on Christmas Eve, because he wasn't a monster, but since they were there. He didn't just scope out their residence once either. 3 different times, David Rice had tried to get a glimpse of the Goldmarks. The first incident was on or around November 1st. David Rice claimed that he went to their street to check what kind of house it was and to get a feel for the neighborhood. He didn't see anyone there, and he wasn't even positive that it was their home. Then a week later, David Rice visited Mr. office building to try to see what he looked like so he would know who his target was. But this time was also a bust. The 3rd attempt was during the first week of December. David Rice returned to their residence to verify whether they were residing there, but once again, no one appeared to be there. In the meantime, David Rice began to prepare for the attack and assassination. He bought an M1 rifle to kill the Goldmarks, but decided that it wasn't a practical weapon due to its bulk and very loud noise. Instead, he chose to purchase a toy gun to intimidate them. David Rice also bought 2 sets of handcuffs and a small dose of chloroform. Since he had no previous experience with the chemical, he administered it to himself first. This way, he could know how long its effects should last on his future victims. On Christmas Eve, he traveled to their residence. He pretended that he was a taxi driver delivering a package. He knocked on the door, and a young boy answered. David Rice told the child that he had a package for his dad. The boy called out for his father, who came to the door. Then David Rice pulled out the toy gun and pushed his way inside. He forced the entire family upstairs to the master bedroom. Mr. Goldmark pointed out $14 in cash that lay on the bedroom dresser. David Rice quickly snagged it and grabbed his wallet, too. He pulled the bank card out and demanded the access code. Charles gave him the number. The intruder instructed the parents to lie face down on the floor. He handcuffed them both with their hands behind their backs, but he didn't tie the children up at the time. Even though David Rice claimed that his motivations were at least half triggered by his demands to find the other local Communist Party members, there was no indication that he ever did at all. Instead, he was solely driven by robbing them. David Rice pulled out the chloroform. Charles Goldmark attempted to prevent him from using it by telling him that he had guests coming over at 7:30 p.m. that night. David Rice ignored him. He first shoved the rag into Charles' face, then to Annie's, who fussed and struggled at the terrible smell. Then, last, he knocked out the two young boys. David Rice began to freak out when he realized it was almost 7:15 p.m. If it were true, what Charles Goldmark had said, and that people were coming over to the house that night, he had less than 15 minutes to complete his mission. He went downstairs and began to rummage through the house for something to kill the family with. David Rice found a 12-inch blade fillet knife inside one of the kitchen drawers. But he wasn't done. He entered a basement storage space and looked around until he found a steam iron. David Rice returned upstairs to the master bedroom. Within less than 5 minutes, he had successfully located his murder weapons. Holding the pointed end of the iron downward, he bludgeoned Charles with a heavy, dense object. David Rice struck him in the back of the head with the iron 4 or 5 times. Then he did the same to Annie on the side of her head. Annie once again showed what a true fighter she was and tried to stop him. He then bashed her in the head with the iron. Annie began to jolt and thrash around. David Rice struck her again a few more times. Annie Goldmark had stopped moving. Then he stood over the children. He slammed the iron down into the back of the boy's skull, striking him 5 or 6 times. Then he did the same thing to the other boy, about 4 times. David Rice then returned to Charles to see if he still had a pulse. He checked the arteries in the neck. Charles was still alive, and so was Annie. This is when he realized that he must finish the job with the knife. David Rice grabbed the knife and inserted the blade into the wound on the back of Charles' skull that had been made by the iron. According to David Rice, when he shoved the knife in, it appeared to reach the opposite side of Charles' skull, so he kind of stirred it around. Then he returned to the 2 small kids. He inserted the knife into their brains and stirred the blade around. But since he had bludgeoned the side of Annie's head, this method wouldn't work, because she didn't have the same kind of wound. So, David Rice picked up the knife and stabbed her in the chest. And again, like the rest of his victims, he stirred the knife around the wound. Although the assailant had been wearing gloves, his clothes as well as the gloves were now drenched in blood. But before he left the Goldmark residence, he wiped off some of the blood and removed the gloves. He failed to take either of the murder weapons or the handcuffs with him as he fled the crime scene. David Rice did remember, though, to turn off the lights. He had planned on taking their vehicle, but wasn't able to access the garage. So he just walked to the closest ATM and tried to use Charles Goldmark's card, but the numbers didn't work. Even though this was the 1980s and CCTV footage didn't exist, let alone mobile phones, there were security cameras at the cash machine. They captured the suspect trying to use Charles Goldmark's card between 7:34 and 7:38 p.m. on Christmas Eve. As David Rice started walking back towards Ann Davis's apartment, he freaked out when he remembered he had left the handcuffs behind. His prints may very well be on those cuffs. David Rice realized that he couldn't take that chance, so he needed to get back into the Goldmark's house. Then he realized that his clothes were spattered with blood. He decided that he better change into clean clothes, so he walked to Ann's place first. He then took a taxi back to the Goldmark's residence. But as he walked closer and closer to their house, he noticed that the lights were back on, and what sounded like a police radio in the distance. That was it. Everything he had done had been for nothing. His fingerprints were on those handcuffs, and now the police had them as evidence. David Rice turned around and left the neighborhood as fast as possible. A few blocks away, he tossed the car keys, bank card, and the piece of paper with the access code into some ivy bushes. When Rice returned to Ann's apartment, he snuck into the storage area and hid items from the murders. Every detail surrounding his confession, including the layout of the house and the location of specific objects within the home, were confirmed to be true and accurate. When police officers searched Ann Davis's apartment, they located various items the suspect had used in the crime. There was the toy gun, a bottle of chloroform, and cloth gloves were found, and the blood-spattered clothing he wore the night of the murder. Ironically, David Rice's fingerprints were never found on the handcuffs. His paranoia had once again gotten the best of him. Further evidence of premeditation of the murders was found and verified through handwriting analysis to be that of David Louis Rice's. A notebook was discovered with the address for the Goldmark's home and the office building where Charles Goldmark worked. It included specific directions on how to travel to their residence by bus. A different page listed items under basic armament for one-man mission. On this list was a knife, guns, a garrote, which is a ligature, a grappling hook, plastic explosives, tear gas grenades, and 2 days' worth of food rations. On a third page within the notebook, the killer had written a series of statements to prepare him for the attack. They included the phrases, "I must be mobile and fluid so that if I am attacked, I can retreat or counterattack, whichever I deem suitable. And I must have the ability to attack any target, regardless of size and capability. This includes weapons, knowledge, physical and mental stamina, and logistics." There was also a separate piece of paper which detailed the steps in surveillance and preparation, with sections crossed out to indicate their completion. It said, get knife, find out what kind of legal services, find out what he looks like, when does he leave office, does he drive, what kind of car, set up time to be there. All of these statements were crossed out. The only step that hadn't been checked off was the name and address of another Seattle attorney. It was learned during his interrogation about 1 month before the Goldmarks were murdered that David Rice had pursued an attack on another Seattle attorney, whom he believed was a crook. However, he was unable to locate the man's residence, and the neighborhood appeared to be too secure. Among their findings, the police also discovered documents on a man named James R. Ellis, a bond lawyer and civic activist. This led investigators to believe that James Ellis may have been the next victim. In letters written to Ann Davis, David Rice openly confessed to both his financial and political motivations behind killing the Goldmarks. One of them read, "Dear Annie, I am writing this in hopes that you will understand why I have decided to take a step into the dark side. Evil is a very powerful force. A long time ago, the mere mention of God was enough to send Satan scurrying for cover. This is not so anymore. This is Satan's world now, and it's going to take more than just words to break him. It is going to take an assault on his empire so strong and so quick that he won't have the resources to recover." Another letter contained the following paragraph. "I just wish I could have helped you with some of your problems, such as money. Believe me, I was trying desperately to fix that for you. I finally decided that I would either do it or die trying. You know the outcome." On December 28th, Ann Davis returned from her Christmas holiday in Seattle to a shocking scene. The police had completely rummaged and turned over every piece of her apartment. She was brought in for questioning 2 days later. Ann Davis claimed that she didn't know anything about David Rice's plans, much less what he had done. Investigators received permission from the defense for her to speak directly with David Rice, with an officer present. They spoke for around 10 minutes, and when Ann inquired as to why he attacked the Goldmarks, all Rice said was, "For the money." Ann asked him more than once why he killed the children, and he replied, "I was in it too far. I had to do it. They could identify me." David Rice spoke highly of Ann Davis to detectives. He said he loved her and wanted to marry her, but she preferred that they just be friends. Rice told the police how she had been a positive influence on his life, and if it weren't for her, he likely would have acted out before the attacks on the Goldmarks. Why communism was his target, he couldn't really say. He simply said that it was a matter of chance. Something else could have become the trigger for his blame, his rage. So who was David Lewis Rice? The life of this brutal family murderer, David Lewis Rice, was one of endless failure and wrought with self-loathing, feelings of victimization, and increasing paranoia. He first experienced pain and shame at 4 years old when he ran into a sliding glass door. The glass door shattered, cutting his right eyebrow so severely that it left him partially blind. After one of many physical and shaming fights he had with his older brothers, David tried to kill himself. He was only 10 years old. He locked the door of his bedroom and attempted to hang himself. David Rice was unsuccessful, and this pattern of failure and self-hatred would follow him like a virus throughout his life until he succumbed to what can only be described as madness. A very tall teenager standing 6'2", David Rice was awkward. He had few friends and didn't do well in school. He ended up dropping out his sophomore year of high school and joined the U.S. Navy, but for some unknown reason, he was discharged while in training. Later, he met a woman, they got married, and had a son. But his wife left him. He wasn't in his son's life anymore, and he filed for bankruptcy. This dire financial situation he found himself in led to his being dismissed as a welder. The snowball of desperation and darkness would lead him to finding a scapegoat for his problems. 3 years before he viciously and callously murdered the Goldmark family on Christmas Eve, David Rice was homeless. He was intermittently sleeping in cars and shelters, but then he met Ann Davis. She was a naturopath, a healthcare practitioner with a more holistic approach, and was an ultra-conservative who introduced David to the Seattle branch of the Duck Club. The Duck Club was an extreme right-wing nationalist group that was anti-Semitic and anti-communist. This hateful conspiracy club was founded by a man named Gordon Jack Moore, a U.S. Army colonel and the self-proclaimed National Military Commander of the Christian Patriots Defense League. Here's where David Lewis Rice would find the perfect scapegoat for his terrible, miserable life. He began to buy into the conspiracy that members of the Communist Party existed in the United States, including a branch in Seattle, that were led by international bankers and the Federal Reserve Board. David Rice became obsessed with Moore's writings and even tried directly contacting him in Mississippi, where he lived at the time. But Moore never gave him the time of day. David Rice also met the man at Duck Club meetings known as Robert Brown, with whom he stayed the night after the murders, which was the same man who turned him into place. The prominent Goldmark family of Seattle was specifically named during one of these Duck Club meetings as having local ties to communism. After performing his own research, David Rice concluded that Charles Goldmark was not only a member, but he was the regional director of the American Communist Party. In David Rice's pathetic, delusional mind, he believed it was his mission to save America and take down Charles Goldmark. Charles Goldmark was the son of a prominent leader in the Progressive Democratic Party during much of the 1960s. His father served as state representative 3 times. While running for the 4th time, his father became the target of a communist conspiracy that would successfully ruin his career. The family later moved to Seattle. Charles Goldmark attended Yale Law School and became a military intelligence officer serving in Europe. This is where he met Annie J. Carlston, a French and Swedish woman who was a French interpreter. They fell in love and were soon married. The couple returned to Seattle, where Annie continued working as a translator, and Charles worked at a law firm, later establishing his own firm that specialized in civil litigation. Like his father, Charles Goldmark became involved in the world of politics. He was a legal counsel for the Washington State Democratic Party and served as a delegate in 1984 for the then-running presidential nominee Gary Hart. It is unknown exactly why David Lewis Rice selected Charles Goldmark and his family as targets, except that he believed Mr. Goldmark to be Jewish and a communist, and he had been the topic of discussion amongst his deplorable acquaintances. However, Charles Goldmark was neither Jewish or a communist. It would be later revealed that after the Goldmark family massacre, David Rice bragged to Homer Brand, who was the head of the Duck Club Seattle branch, about how he had dumped the top communist. There were 4 involved. This was a clear indication that not only was David Rice not regretful of brutally murdering an entire family, including 2 small children on Christmas Eve no less, but he was desperately seeking approval from these irrational, imbalanced, hate-spreading conspirators. David Rice was charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The state prosecutor was seeking the death penalty. He entered a plea of not guilty, in addition to a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. However, according to David Rice's attorney, he was fully competent to stand trial. It was bifurcated, meaning that the trial was done in 2 phases. During the determination or guilt phase, David Rice and his counsel didn't deny that he had murdered the Goldmark family. The defense counsel presented their case in 2 separate ways to illustrate how David Rice was insane at the time of the attack and murders. They first presented testimony from several witnesses who could attest to his erratic, unorthodox views, including Ann Davis. She testified to his not being able to distinguish the difference between right and wrong or understand the gravity of his acts on the night he killed the Goldmarks. She was not an expert witness because personal knowledge is not equal to a professional assessment, but her testimony was allowed. Another witness testified as to how the defendant was convinced that a nuclear war was on the horizon, and he wanted to build a shelter in Colorado to house hundreds of people underground for years, until the radiation diminished. David Rice also told people that he had a black box in his head where he placed problems that he couldn't solve. He also believed that extraterrestrial beings were guiding him in his actions. Sam Kean, who was an author of psychology but not a licensed psychologist, interviewed David Rice about several different ideologies and beliefs he held. Sam Kean was not considered an expert by the trial court since he was only an author, and therefore could not testify as to his opinion on David Rice's mental state. However, the jury was presented with an interview he had with David Rice about 3 months after the murders. Sam Kean did not believe that David Rice understood the nature and quality of his acts because he thought it was right to kill the enemy. David Rice believed he was chosen to prevent communism and banking conspiracies from taking control. He believed enemy troops were lurking, ready to attack the borders at any moment. He claimed to be insane at the time of the crime because his brain had shut down. David Rice described this condition as something he randomly experienced, where he was incapable of answering specific questions about himself or the world. He claimed that while he is experiencing this state, he is much more prone to suggestion by others. He said that at one point during the attack on the Goldmarks, Annie said, "He is going to kill us." David Rice believed that he was in a war against evil, and that, like a soldier who sometimes has to kill and die in battle, he had to kill the Goldmarks to be rid of the greater evil. These statements and beliefs were presented to support the defense's argument that anyone who holds such thoughts must be insane. The defense next asserted that David Rice was insane under the McNaughton test for insanity. This is a test that determines a person is insane if, during the time of the criminal offense, the person was suffering from a mental disease or defect that rendered them incapable of perceiving the nature and quality of the acts they are charged with, or the individual was unable to tell right from wrong. Under this latter prong of the test, David Rice's mental illness prevented him from understanding right from wrong, since even though he knew murder was wrong, he believed in his war against evil, that killing the Goldmarks was the lesser of two. However, the prosecution countered their argument with psychiatric results that didn't indicate any mental illness. A psychiatric staff member at the King County Jail testified that the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which he gave to the defendant 2 days after he was arrested and charged with murder, showed that these test results were more aligned with a personality disorder than psychosis. They were reflective of a profile that was cold, distant, lacking empathy, and highly narcissistic. It was also found in a test to determine competency that David Rice suffered from no organic brain problems. Dr. John Mullins, a neurologist, performed a complete examination and the defendant's results were normal. An intelligence test had also been conducted, which indicated that David Rice had a normal or high average level of intelligence. A Rorschach test, which is the infamous ink blot test, was also conducted, which showed that the defendant had a, quote, deep personality disorder and a disordered childhood. But there were no signs of psychosis. Dr. Muscatel testified that based on the multiple test results, in addition to certain materials given by the counsel, 9 interviews held with David Rice and interviews with 4 of his family members, he believed that David Rice was legally sane at the time of the offense. He characterized David Rice as an extremely disturbed individual with schizoid and paranoid features, but that there were no signs of his being psychotic or paranoid schizophrenic. Dr. Muscatel asserted that David Rice didn't qualify as insane under the McNaughton test under either of these prongs. He didn't meet the requirements under the first based on the facts that he fully understood the nature and quality of his heinous actions. He enacted a high degree of awareness, cognizance, and organization in planning and executing the act. This was impossible to dispute given the extensive material evidence of his detailed steps in the preparation of the killings. Dr. Muscatel further testified that there was 0 evidence of any confused or severely disorganized behavior before, during, or after the murders. David Rice also didn't meet the second prong. Dr. Muscatel first addressed how at first his ideology and beliefs were delusional and psychotic, but David Rice's ideas were not created in his own mind. David Rice had been associated with numerous right-wing groups and individuals, including his friend Ann Davis, from whom he had learned of these conspiracies. They were ideas shared by those in his life, and therefore were not beliefs stemming from his delusions. Secondly, even if David Rice believed that the killing of the Goldmark's parents was condoned in the war against evil, this didn't apply to the brutal slaying of 2 innocent small children. Therefore, Rice was fully capable of understanding the distinction between right and wrong. His lack of insanity and high degree of awareness around the wrongfulness of his actions were further supported by his behavior during and after the crime. David Rice used gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints at the crime scene. He wiped blood from his clothes and turned out the lights to make it appear as if the Goldmarks weren't home. When he realized he had left the handcuffs at their house, he rushed back, knowing that if they were discovered, he would likely be caught because his fingerprints would be on them. When David Rice became aware that the victims had been found, he disposed of the car keys and the bank card. He also had written letters explicitly acknowledging the wrongfulness of his actions. The only factor of David Rice's alleged insanity that didn't fit was his belief that extraterrestrial beings were guiding his actions. However, the doctor explained that when talking to Rice about them, he said it wasn't as if they were dictating his actions, whether they were an influence on him. In his words, he told the doctor, "I could follow them or not follow them, though if I didn't follow them, bad things tended to happen. If I did follow them, good things tended to happen." The prosecution also addressed how David Rice's state of mind changed drastically between the time of his arrest and when experts began testing him. They contended that he had plenty of time to fabricate his mental illness. To close, the state argued that the defendant had altered the characterization of his mental state from the time of his confession to when he told Dr. Muscatel about these episodes that shut down his mind and made him highly susceptible to other suggestions. In the months following the murders, it was believed that David Rice had undergone a process of rationalization regarding the killings. To minimize his guilt and thus his criminal culpability, he downplayed all of the evidence supporting premeditation in the Goldmark murders. And instead, he focused on his obsession to get information on the communist members. Dr. Muscatel also pointed out that, in general, there is greater reliability, and thus accuracy, in statements that are made soon after an event occurred, rather than statements made later. It seemed obvious that once David Rice realized the gravity of his situation, in particular, the death penalty which he possibly faced as punishment if convicted, his reliance on his poor mental state at the time of the offense had increasingly become the focus. David Lewis Rice never once expressed remorse for the premeditated, carefully planned execution of the Goldmark parents. He conveyed that he hadn't planned on killing the two young boys, but felt he had no other choice since they could identify him. As the defense counsel pointed out, which was supported by testimony given by family and friends, David Rice had no history of violence or aggression. Any violence that had ever been shown was inflicted on himself, with 2 known incidents of attempted suicide. He had been subject to violence and harassment by his older brothers, who name-called him, beat him up, and kicked him. The only reason given was that they were ashamed of their odd little brother, who didn't fit in. The offender had no history with the criminal justice system, which should have been considered a mitigating factor. Still, the horrific and merciless nature of his crime overshadowed anything else. Despite the strong arguments attempted by the defense, the jury saw through what they perceived to be a facade of mental illness. They rejected the insanity defense and convicted him on all 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The aggravating factors included how the murders were committed to cover up a crime, as they were part of a plan to kill more than one person, and they occurred during the commission of a felony, that being robbery or burglary. On June 5, 1986, David Lewis Rice was found guilty on 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Once he was found guilty on all charges, the death penalty phase began. The defense counsel called upon 4 relatives of David Rice's to testify to his lack of violent history and that they all loved him. One of his older brothers testified to how, as a child, David was physically and mentally abused by the brothers. His brother believed that it had an adverse long-term impact on his mental state. The defense counsel also argued that if he were spared the death sentence, David Rice would still not pose any future threat to society because he would be incarcerated for the rest of his life. The prosecution didn't present any additional evidence to support its recommendation. However, they read 2 passages for the jury to think long and hard about when deciding whether or not the defendant merited leniency in the death penalty. The first passage read, and I quote, "The fact that 2 of these victims were children, a 10-year-old boy and a 12-year-old boy, was irrelevant to Phase 1. It now becomes something for you to consider in Phase 2. The fact that the family was killed in their own home on Christmas Eve was irrelevant to Phase 1. It was not an element of the crime, but it is a part of this crime and a part of what makes this crime one of those very few crimes that screams out for the death penalty as the only acceptable punishment." The prosecutor then stated to the jurors, "Put yourself, if you will, in the shoes of those 2 children who have been gathered in their parents' bedroom with a man who they believe has got a gun. And they're told to lay down on the floor, face down in their parents' bedroom. They comply. And it's starting to come to Derek and Colin that whatever child believes that their parents can protect them from anything, especially in their own home, is not true. And as Derek and Colin hear the click of the handcuffs fastening around the wrists of their father and the click of the handcuffs as they're gathering around the wrists of their mother, what are they thinking? And as the defendant comes closer to them and cinches the sweaters up tight, these are factors that you should consider in keeping in mind the crime. Then the defendant going with the chloroform first to Dad, and there is no indication that there was any words or struggle at that point. Then to the mother, who struggled at the nasty smell that the defendant talked about. And then finally to the point where that nasty smell of chloroform is coming closer to their faces. And their last conscious thoughts on this earth are the terror in that bedroom. That is the crime that the defendant committed. That is the crime that you have to have in mind when you weigh whether the state has convinced you beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating circumstances the so-called mitigating circumstances merit leniency. While the jury deliberated on whether to impose the death penalty on David Rice, they were asked to answer the following question. Having in mind the crime of which the defendant has been found guilty, are you convinced, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there are not sufficient mitigating circumstances to merit leniency? The jury requested during this time that they listen to the defendant's confession tape once more, without the presence of David Rice or his counsel. Defense agreed. However, when the jury came to a verdict, David Rice was no longer in the courtroom. He had been rushed to the hospital due to an ingestion of liquid nicotine. Staff at the hospital called the judge to inform them that Rice was stable, but that he remained unresponsive. It was assumed that David Rice had attempted to take his own life before the jury could make that decision for him. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed that the verdict could be announced in David Rice's absence. The jury announced that leniency in the death penalty was not merited. David Lewis Rice was sentenced to death. He wouldn't return to the courtroom for several days, where he would then receive his grim fate. Any death sentence case is automatically provided with the opportunity to appeal. There were multiple claims made to contest the jury's decision. I will discuss a few of the more relevant and interesting claims. The first claim David Rice made was regarding the admission of photographs of the victims. During the criminal trial, the prosecution displayed 4 pictures, each one of a different member of the Goldmark family in a moment of life. The defense objected to their admission, citing that it was unfairly prejudicial and irrelevant. However, the state claimed that they were relevant to establish the identity of each victim. David Rice offered to identify the victims himself, but this was denied, and the judge allowed the in-life photographs. The admissibility of photographs of victims in a courtroom has long been an issue of conflict and debate, but more often for photos of the deceased, because they tend to be so disturbing and grotesque that it is believed to cause unfair prejudice of the jury, and the violent nature outweighs the value. Similar issues are considered when photographs that are referred to as in life are presented to the jury. The appellate court decided that admission by the trial court was not a violation of his due process rights. The second appeal claim was based on the admission of clothing. Located at the crime scene were multiple blood-stained items. These included a bathrobe, a shirt, 2 sweaters, eyeglasses, a handkerchief, and a napkin. All of these items were admitted as evidence to which the defense objected to, on similar grounds of prejudicial effect over probative value. The appellate court determined that the trial court had not abused its discretion with their admission. The third claim involved a statement made during the closing argument, in which the jury was told legal insanity requires that the defendant has lost contact with reality so completely that he is beyond any of the influences of the criminal law. David Rice claimed that this argument was a misstatement of the law and deprived him of his rights to a fair trial. The appellate court clarified that the statement was taken from language in some of the court's opinions. However, they agreed that it was improper and concluded that any statements to the jury as to the law are restricted to the law as outlined in the jury instructions. In the trial court, the judge had only given the jury instruction based on the McNaughton test, so the court did determine that the prosecution had exceeded these rules. However, it's not as simple as this. The appellant bears the sole burden of proof to show that the argument was not only improper, but prejudicial to the jury, to the extent that the misconduct affected the verdict, thus depriving him of a fair trial. The appellate court concluded that the likelihood of this didn't exist for 3 reasons. First, the argument didn't misstate the law, and secondly, the prosecutor didn't expand on this past statement. Third, the jury was instructed to disregard any argument not supported by the law given to them by the judge. One of the more interesting claims the appellant made was regarding the inclusion of additional language for the instruction of insanity. During his criminal trial, David Rice proposed that the following regarding deific or divine commands be added. One who believes that he is acting under the direct command of God is no less insane because he nevertheless knows murder is prohibited by the laws of man. This exact language was taken from State v. Cameron in 1983. David Lewis Rice argued that this instruction was strongly supported by the evidence, including a letter he wrote discussing his battle with Satan, and a passage in his interview with author Sam Kean, where he spoke about being a missionary of God. His defense counsel argued that the urges sent by aliens or extraterrestrial beings that David Rice claimed to experience were examples of such a deific command, except that in David Rice's case, based on his own admission, he was not compelled by God or aliens for that matter to do anything, much less slaughter an entire family. David Rice also argued that the emotional nature of the state's closing argument was an improper appeal to passion and prejudice when the prosecutor addressed the fact that the victims were children killed. Children were killed on Christmas Eve in their home. These were the passages read by the prosecution as described earlier. Even the most serious and unemotive of prosecutors would be incapable of not presenting the emotional nature of a family murder, including that of 2 small children, on Christmas Eve. This statement in itself would be enough to sway almost any jury member that David Lewis Rice was a monster, an evil, soulless man who deserved to be put to death. On August 16, 1988, the appellate court denied the petitioner David Lewis Rice's claims of his rights being violated, and his death sentence was reaffirmed. However, this was not the end of his appeal process. In 1995, a court shockingly and with much controversy reversed David Lewis Rice's death sentence and remanded for a new penalty trial. This decision was based on the previously disregarded claim that his rights were violated when the jury verdict was read in his absence. At the time of the incident, it was allowed and agreed upon by his defense counsel because it was believed that David Rice had attempted to commit suicide by drinking liquid nicotine, which led him to be hospitalized. His attorney, without his approval, agreed to have the verdict read without his presence. According to David Rice, he claimed that he drank the liquid nicotine, which he sometimes used as a substitute for smoking, because he knew he wouldn't be able to once he was returned to jail. This provided a different perspective on his actions, and the court determined that his rights were violated due to his attorney's inadequate representation. It is difficult to deny the importance of a convicted offender being present at court for their own verdict. For any sentence, it would be important for each juror to affirm their decision by looking the defendant in the eye, as they have been given the ultimate responsibility for another's fate. It is essential to understand that just because a verdict has been decided behind closed doors doesn't mean that an individual juror can't change their mind once they enter the courtroom. They are not legally bound by their vote in the jury room and have every right to register dissent, that is, to disagree with the majority verdict. For a death sentence case, this is absolutely critical because one juror can change the course. Under Washington law, the death penalty must be agreed upon by all jurors. Ensuring that the defendant is present to face their punishment is a fundamental part of upholding the fairness and transparency of the judicial process. The court also agreed that a new hearing must be held to address the claims that David Rice's lawyers had failed to determine his mental state before allowing him to confess to the crimes to detectives and speak to the media, neither of which was in his best interest. It is also interesting to note that even though mental health professionals couldn't agree on whether or not David Rice was fully competent, they all concluded that he suffered from paranoid delusional disorder. One psychiatrist stated that they believed he was incapable of understanding the nature and quality of his actions on the day of the murders. And yet, this exculpatory evidence was unlawfully withheld by the prosecution. And his lawyer never requested that the prosecution's psychiatric evidence be handed over. So none of these results and findings were ever presented to the jury, which may have been crucial in deciding the verdict and the penalty. Since this was the 1980s and mental health was likely not handled with the same due diligence as hopefully it is in most criminal courts today, it's unlikely that the psychiatric examinations of David Louis Rice were thorough, much less accurate. I would not at all be surprised if the murder trial had been held today. David Rice would have been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. As it were, all of the psychiatrists agreed that he suffered from paranoid delusions. Although David Louis Rice was not technically a serial killer, he was a multiple murderer, who, by all documented evidence, had full intentions on murdering many more people. For this reason, his criminal profile aligns with that of a serial killer, specifically the mission-oriented serial murderer. Mission-based serial killers are what they sound like they are. These are killers that are on a mission to rid the world of individuals or groups of people whom they have deemed to be undesirable. These are the types of murderers who frequently target drug addicts, sex workers, and the homeless because they perceive them as being less valuable to society and not worthy of living. Such killers typically hold extreme ideologies and view their violent actions as what is necessary to change or uphold society. David Louis Rice could also be viewed through the profile of a lone wolf killer. This kind of murderer has been described as someone who uses or threatens the use of violence or nonviolent sabotage, alone or with minimal support of one or two others, to further an agenda or a goal, whether it is political, religious, social, or another kind. If one is to believe that David Louis Rice was hearing voices and receiving guidance from extraterrestrial beings, as he called them, then he also fits within the profile of a visionary killer. A visionary-based serial killer believes that a person or an entity is commanding them to kill. As mentioned, all of the psychiatrists who examined David Louis Rice believed him to be suffering from paranoid delusions, antisocial personality disorder, and schizoid-type symptoms. Research has shown that paranoia, specifically the inclusion of persecutory delusions, is a frequent symptom of an individual who is afflicted with a mental health disorder. Persecutory or paranoid delusions are just as they sound. They involve the false beliefs that someone is being harassed, targeted, and conspired against to be persecuted. This can often lead to social withdrawal, anxiety, and exhibiting aggressive and violent behavior. An individual suffering from paranoia tends to blame external forces for the negative events in their life and the world around them. They frequently blame others and perceive them to be a threat. In return, in the mind of a paranoid offender, a violent reaction toward the perceived persecutor is justified as self-protection. Some studies have shown that the risk of a violent response increases in someone with both paranoid delusions and antisocial personality disorder. Against all odds, David Louis Rice had achieved what is impossible for most convicted offenders. The quadruple murderer had proven that his defense counsel had failed to meet the standards of legal representation, and thus his conviction and his death sentence were successfully overturned. Although the success rate differs based on the type of crime and other factors, such as the specific state involved in an appellate case, successfully winning an appeal is relatively rare. Studies indicate that a convicted offender will succeed in their appeal less than 7% of the time, and the likelihood is even lower during a habeas corpus motion. This is primarily due to the extremely high standards of review set by the courts, which create obstacles and challenges that most appellants can't overcome. The rate of reversal in the U.S. Court of Appeals is very scarce, and those who make claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, such as in the case of David Louis Rice, are noted for being especially difficult. Based on the high, almost impossible to reach legal standard set by 1984's Strickland v. Washington, an appellant must prove two things. First, they must show that their lawyer's performance was deficient and did not meet a reasonable expectation or standard of legal representation. Second, they must prove that this low performance led to prejudice in the case, which means that their judicial outcome would likely have been different if it weren't for the incompetence of their representation. Winning an appeal and being granted a new trial and sentencing trial does not equate to being acquitted. Rather, it means the convicted criminal has now been given a rare opportunity with new legal representation in their new trial, which potentially could result in a different verdict. In 1998, in a shocking turn of events, David Louis Rice pled guilty to 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. In return, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. At last, the legal chapters of this tragic case have been closed. David Louis Rice is currently incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary. The issue of mental illness and diminished criminal culpability, specifically when considering the use of capital punishment, continues to be an area of controversy and debate in the courts. Since 1986, the Supreme Court has taken different strides in banning the death penalty for those afflicted with serious mental disabilities, including mental illness. Under Ford v. Wainwright, the court held that the rights under the Eighth Amendment prohibit imposing the death penalty on individuals with severe mental illness. However, at the time, this was focused on a convict who was deemed insane. In 2002, in Atkins v. Virginia, the Supreme Court found that executing a mentally disabled person violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. In 2007, Panetti v. Quarterman, the court further clarified the definition of competence, focusing on the ability to irrationally understand the death sentence and its purpose, rather than merely having a recollection of committing the crime. The most recent decision by the court was in 2019, which clarified that an individual can't be executed if their concept of reality is so impaired that they can't understand the meaning or purpose of the death penalty. None of these rulings has banned its use on individuals diagnosed with a severe mental illness. The Supreme Court has simply declared it to be an unconstitutional practice. However, some states have fought to stop the execution of the mentally insane, specifically Kentucky and Ohio being a few of the first. As development in mental health awareness and cognitive disabilities has increased through the decades, so have the courts and society's perception change towards executing persons who are considered less culpable due to their impairment or illness. Many studies have shown that most individuals in the United States are against the execution of someone who is mentally ill. However, the practice continues today. Since 2023, the death penalty has been officially abolished in the state of Washington. In 2018, the state Supreme Court ruled in State v. Gregory that the sentence is unconstitutional, citing its arbitrary and racially biased historical use of the punishment. Since 2018, any individuals given a death sentence have been commuted to life imprisonment. But at the time of these tragic and horrific events, receiving the death penalty was still a possibility. This case ignited rage in many proponents of capital punishment, serving as a reminder that the actions of an incompetent attorney can disrupt the course of justice. The Goldmark family murders remains one of the most disturbing hate crimes and politically motivated violent acts committed by an individual in the United States. The year after the Goldmarks were murdered, a foundation was established to honor their legacy in the city and the causes the family believed in. Amongst the many beneficiaries throughout the years were the nonprofit Legal Foundation of Washington, of which Charles Goldmark was a founder. It supports the Goldmark Equal Access to Justice internships for law students. The Seattle-Nantes Sister City Association was another beneficiary that created scholarships to further relationships between France and the United States, a cause that deeply mattered to Annie Goldmark. The Victims Assistant Unit of the Seattle Police Department was also named as a beneficiary of the foundation due to the amazing support they provided the friends of the Goldmarks in the wake of the tragedy. Seattle was horrified and shocked by these grisly family murders during the Christmas holiday. That 2 small children were amongst the victims appalled the community, and they demanded justice for the Goldmarks. There is a darkness that clouds over the city to this day. a cloud of hatred, anti-Semitism, and paranoia that induced violence, which once polluted the town and stole the lives of 4 beautiful innocent people. At Madrona Drive and Lake Washington Boulevard, in what was renamed the Goldmark Overlook, a commemorative metal plaque is located. There are 4 silhouettes, 2 adults and 2 kids, walking in a scene that mirrors the overlook they once admired. The same breathtaking panoramic view of the mountains that the family loved to explore together. At the bottom of the plaque, it reads, "This overlook is named in memory of Charles, Annie, Derek, and Colin Goldmark, who loved Seattle and its open spaces." Thank you so much for listening to this tragic, heartbreaking story of the Goldmark family murders during Christmas. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to keep bringing you stories. As I've mentioned before, if you could just make sure that you are following, subscribed, leave a rating on Apple or Spotify, and leave a review. It means so much to me, and it really helps for the show to grow. I would like to give a special shout out to Shan_NYC for their lovely, supportive review. It says, "Compassionate reporting. I usually listen before bed, and Alita's voice is very soothing, and she's incredibly empathetic in her storytelling and with honoring each victim. Highly recommend." Thank you so much, Shan. It means the world to me. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, written, researched, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.